But I think there's different levels of trust in terms of like, they trust the workout you're giving them is like spot on for the day. But there's another level of trust of them opening up saying, I'm having a really bad day with the family or with whatever, and to like open up deeper to you, to have that intimacy as you reference. That can take time to build, that side of trust.
Oh, absolutely. That's something we go through with every athlete that we onboard. I don't care whether they're going to go climb their first mountain or they're going to be competing for the podium at a major race. It takes time. You're actually having to build this relationship, which is a very time-consuming process. I've said this before in public. Any idiot can write a training plan, frankly. The difficulty is administering that plan so that it's effective for the athlete. It's adjusting it on a daily basis, as you said, Dirk, dealing with the ups and downs of life and all of that's again the art of coaching.
You're listening to Endurance Unlimited, a TrainingPeaks podcast for athletes and coaches, no matter what you're training for. Dial in those workouts with deep insights and cutting-edge science from the most prominent voices in the endurance and hybrid sports world.
Scott, thank you for joining us. Obviously, Scott Johnston, amazing coach in the alpine world, uphill things, ultra things, all the pieces of endurance training. We're really curious to talk about a lot of topics today, but less about the X's and O's of the actual training, but so much more about working with athletes. In particular, how do you get them to that starting line? How do you ensure that what they've experienced in their training is going to be effective for that race, here, there, wherever it might be, different circumstances, different distances, all those kinds of things. We're just really excited to talk to you a bit more about those components of training. But by and large, give us a little bit of a snapshot of, what you've been doing over this last year and who all you're coaching and what's been going on in your world.
Well, as you guys know, you were firsthand witness to my world kind of getting turned on its head almost a year ago now, 11 months ago, with the double win at UTMB. Dirk said to me that very day, things are going to change pretty dramatically for you and your business at that point. And he was, once again, this wasn't the first time Dirk has given me sage advice. So he was 100% right about that. And so since that time, almost exactly a year ago, it's been kind of playing catch up, trying to, be able to deal with the massively increased demand that Evoke Endurance has seen for coaching. Certainly immediately after the race, I was deluged with, whether it was Instagram messages or emails asking me to work with people and coach them. And one of the things that I'm not really able to, because I'm also kind of heavily involved in running the business. I can't really coach that many folks. And also, I really owe my allegiance to the athletes I have been working with for, a decade, in some cases even more than a decade. And I can't spread myself too thin. And so, unfortunately, I've had to say no to a lot more people than I would like to. Luckily for me, we've got a bunch of other great coaches that are also capable, I have to say, of putting people, on the top major races, like, winning Western States last year. Jack Kunzel coached the winner to that race a year ago. And one of our other coaches has coached people on the podium at Hardrock. So we're not shy on other folks. They may not have quite the name recognition I do. So it's been partly educating the public on the fact that, Evoke Endurance isn't just me. I've got 20 other coaches I'm working with, that all of whom are trained by me and adhere to identical training philosophies. Some of them are, more comfortable in coaching, let's say, mountaineers or cross-country skiers, skimo athletes. We kind of coach a broad spectrum. But in general, most of them are going to be applying, they would coach you the same way I would coach you if you came to me. So, but anyway, it's been, a big change business-wise, because before that, even though, both Tom and Ruth, the ones who won UTMB last year, I've been working with them for years. Both of them have won other major races leading into the UTMB, and both of them have been on the podium at UTMB in the past. Both of them are Western States winners. But for some reason, nobody paid attention to that up until, August 28th or 9th last year. And all of a sudden people said, oh, these guys must actually coach runners. And, we've been coaching runners for a long time, but it's just that runners are just one population that we coach. But it seems like all of a sudden people recognize that we were the real player in the running world. Despite the previous successes we'd had. So, I feel like we've kind of adjusted our, we've expanded the coaching staff a little bit, brought back a couple of coaches that used to work for us years in the past, a couple of coaches that I trained over 10 years ago, who've been doing different things, and I managed to persuade them to, hey, pretty please, would you come back to work? We really need you back here. So I think we're pretty much on top of it now. We don't have quite the backlog and waiting list that we had a few months ago. So anyway, that's kind of it in a nutshell, is really how my last year has gone.
You have certainly blown it out of the park for sure. People took notice, as you mentioned. But it's funny because you are so well known, I think, for a few topics, which you talk about probably weekly on every podcast out there. The muscular endurance, the weighted uphill, the aerobic threshold, all this foundational, X's and O's of training. Certainly the books reinforce that, training for the new alpinism, training for the uphill athlete. But yet I think a lot of actual success comes down to, again, what's between the ears. That mental state of getting the athlete on the start line in that sweet spot, a mental state whereby do they have like questions? Every athlete starts with like these overwhelming questions of, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I overcome whatever it may be? Whether you're an age grouper, amateur, or pro. And oftentimes that's really the definition of success, is how you deal with the mental state, on the start line. So I think that's what we really want to try and dig into today. And do you see differences between the pros and the athletes? If you were to look at them on the start line and their mental state, are you treating both the same approaching the start line? And are there differences as they start, in terms of their confidence levels?
That's a great question. And I think I want to take a slight step back to lay a little groundwork and context for this discussion. But first of all, I think of coaching, as you probably know, my background really at elite coaching started with coaching cross-country skiers at the World Cup level. Well, it didn't start at the World Cup level, but it terminated. I spent about almost 15 years working with athletes at the World Cup level. And in those days, I was with the athletes personally, physically with them during most of their training. And that's a huge advantage when you can watch body language, you can hear the gripes and the complaints, and you get the feedback instantly from people. You can adjust the training, in the middle of a workout. You can say, okay, we're done today, it's over. And when I shifted into this online coaching world about, 10, 12 years ago, I guess now, it's a completely different thing. You no longer have access to, look into the athlete's eyes on a daily basis. What I learned during that in-person training period, though, was that coaching is it's really an intimate relationship that you have with the athlete. You're going to see the best and the worst of people. And their souls will be bared to you in many cases because they're going to be in extremis. They're going to have good days and bad days. They're going to have terrible races, and you really get to know people. So what I took away from that, and honestly, and this is not a plug although it is a plug for you guys, it's one of the things that really appeals to me about TrainingPeaks is there's no way that I or any of our coaches, and frankly, I think any online coaching business can have the ability, we can't look into their eyes, but we can at least look into data. And if we combine the hard data that we get from their fancy watches with the comments they're getting, and if you develop this kind of relationship that I would like to talk a little more about, this intimacy that you have with your athlete, there's these pieces that you can pull together that are very close to actually being next to the athlete during their training. And we couldn't do that without a platform like TrainingPeaks. And also we couldn't do that. And this is something I heavily rely on with all my coaches, and they're all very well trained in this, is we require daily communication with our athletes. And we leave it up to the coaches exactly how they do this. I mean, usually the first line of communication is through TrainingPeaks comments. So we have a record. And now, of course, with this messaging part of TrainingPeaks, that helps also. But most of our coaches also are in text contact with their athletes daily, so that they're going to get immediate feedback if there's something going on with the athlete, even positive or negative. And this helps maintain that intimacy that I think is so critical, because when you're working with, and for most of my career, I coached junior skiers, and I've coached an awful lot of amateur athletes. And typically, when the coach athlete relationship is a little skewed when you're working with a beginner, let's say, where almost anything you prescribe to that athlete is going to help them. Unless you're a terrible, terrible coach, but you're almost anything you have them do that's structured and progressive is going to give them good results. As the level, and so it's in a little bit, it's kind of hierarchical at that point. The coach is up here and the athlete's down here, and it's pretty much a, hey, do this and you'll get better. But as the athlete's level rises, and especially when they get to an elite or world-class level, then and it's much more exciting for the coach, but it's also much more challenging. Now you are in a very much more of a partnership, collaborative working relationship where, hey, let's try this. Remember last time we did this? How did this work? How did it feel to you? And they're so highly tuned, they're usually going to be able to give you really good feedback. And that, of course, is challenging for the coach. It helps you become a better coach. But this partnership, you're going to have a partnership even when there's this hierarchy. But as the athlete's level comes up, the partnership becomes, and especially the longer you work with it, like Tom and Ruth, I've worked for 5 years. I know how they're going to respond to certain training, and they know what I want when I say do it this way. I know how what they're likely to say, and of course then the big red flag goes up if they don't feel that way. But this collaborative partnership arrangement, I think, is the most important. It's the art of coaching. We have all the science in the world to back up coaching, but if you're not missing the art aspect of it, the personal connection, the human, the humanness of it all, then you're missing, I believe, especially at a high level, the principal part of coaching, the part that makes it exciting and interesting, but also I think that gives you the best possible results. Now, I'll stop there if you have something else to say, but Dirk, I want to go back to what you were just asking about. I have 3 more
questions from that, but
okay.
When you say intimate relationship, I think trust. Yeah. That trust has been built up over the 5 years with Tom and Ruth. Maybe it wasn't there on day one, or was it? That evolution, there's a lot of threads here.
Well, first of all, I was incredibly fortunate that Tom reached out to me 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago now. It might be 4 years and 11 months, but we're very close to when he first contacted me. And he told me why he was coming to me, and it was because of that book, the book Training for the Uphill Athlete, that I co-authored with Kilian Jornet. Now, he took a gamble. I had coached some decent level, nationally ranked, national level athletes, running athletes before, but he liked the idea that I was kind of coming at this sport with a different approach than, because of my background in skiing and these other sports. And so he took a gamble on me. but he trusted that I knew what I was doing, which I'm very fortunate, because at that point, yeah, I had a pretty good idea of how to coach somebody to do this sport, but it wasn't tested out with an athlete of his caliber. And then it was only through his success that a year later, Ruth reached out to me and saw, oh, I see what you've done with Tom. I'm really interested in taking that same approach. Would you work with me? So yes, it required a kind of a leap of faith, honestly, on their part. And I was flattered and I was excited to work with athletes at that level. I've been incredibly fortunate that Tom and Ruth are not only great athletes, but they're just wonderful human beings as well. But you're right, it takes trust for sure, because they're putting, for a professional, they're putting their career in your hands.
Absolutely. But I think there's different levels of trust in terms of like, they trust the workout you're giving them is like spot on for the day. But there's another level of trust of them opening up saying, I'm having a really bad day with my wife or with the family or with whatever, and to like open up deeper to you, to have that intimacy as you reference. That can take time to build, that side of trust.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something we go through with every athlete that we onboard. I don't care whether they're going to go climb their first mountain or they're going to be competing for the podium at a major race. It takes time. You're actually having to build this relationship, which is a very time consuming process. I mean, as I said earlier, I've said this before in public. Any idiot can write a training plan, frankly. I mean, the difficulty is administering that plan so that it's effective for the athlete. It's adjusting it on a daily basis, as you said, Dirk, dealing with the ups and downs of life and all of that. That's again the art of coaching. That it's, yes, you could pick up a book, or you could go online as we talked about before, you talk about AI, you could ask AI, what should I do tomorrow? But there's a big step between that fairly mechanistic view of what training is. Okay, here's the workout, you need to do these many repetitions at this speed, blah blah blah, and the actual fulfillment of the end goal. How do we get the athlete to that point? Which I do have this is the thing I wanted to say, how we get the athlete to move from point A to point B over time. And it's a process. And initially when we usually tell our athletes that, it's going to take us a month of almost daily communication before you understand the coach and the coach understands you, whether it's, restrictions due to work and where you live and travel, or in our case, you understanding, here's what we want out of this type of training session. And, eventually things begin to mesh, but it's not an overnight thing. Again, we're not just saying, okay, here's a spreadsheet, go do these workouts. Boom, you're done. If it was that simple, then they wouldn't need us, honestly.
So on that, I'm curious, on that note, you've worked with some of your premier athletes for years on end. How do you continue to develop year over year, create either continuity or sort of freshness in the training to keep them engaged and all those kinds of things? Like, what is your philosophy on building year over year?
Well, I think the first and most basic step for any coach onboarding a new athlete, and where you have to start, is what's the low-hanging fruit for that athlete? What is it that's keeping them from being faster, better, whatever it is they're trying to do? And analyze that. That's not a very difficult task to say, okay, going back to the mechanistic side of it, we have very fundamental qualities that are involved in sports that, whether it's technique or, some skills, speed, power, endurance, all of those things are fundamental qualities. And how do you measure, whether the athlete is deficient in one of those areas that's keeping them from performing at the level they need to? Now, as Dirk said in the beginning, one of the things that we have found, over the years, is that many people come to us and are aerobically deficient. They just can't produce much horsepower without, having to utilize the anaerobic side of their metabolism. And so that's really low-hanging fruit, because without a big aerobic base, you are never going to be a successful endurance athlete. I don't care if it's, you're going to try to run the 1 mile or 100 miles. It doesn't matter. You have to have that aerobic base. So that's a place we can usually start with people. Strength and speed and power are the other, I'm at the other end of the spectrum of like, okay, we need to analyze these things. Like, is this person weak? Are they slow? Are they, they're just not very powerful. So once we establish, okay, which of these fundamental qualities are most likely deficient and that we can improve for the athlete, then we start training those qualities individually in the base period. So let's say we have an aerobic base training session that's going to probably be fairly low intensity for them. And at the same time, we can have, a strength session that's not going to conflict with that, but we won't bring strength and endurance together until much further down the road, when they've developed, strength, or in some cases muscular endurance and an aerobic base. Then we can start bringing those two qualities together, or 2 or 3 qualities together in a workout, and then the workout looks fairly specific. One of the things that I think most people, we understand the concept of specificity in sports training, that your training should look like your sport. But I believe there's an over-reliance on specificity, in that people think, well, my sport is doing X, so I should just do X all the time, every single workout. Well, that would be like, Eliud Kipchoge running a marathon every day. So yeah, that would, taking that to an extreme. Or, I watched a presentation, and I don't remember his name, this Jamaican coach who coached Usain Bolt. And he talked about Bolt's training. This is at the height of his career, leading into, was it 2012, when he, kind of blew everybody's brains, mine for sure. And talked about how seldom he ran 100 meters. Like all the work this guy did, thousands of hours and hours. And like he ran 100 meters, 6 times in a month. Like, okay, everything else was all these other qualities that were brought together. Whereas if you really truly adhere to specificity, every time that guy went to the track, he should have just ran 100 meters. And so what I see is that people go right to specificity, thinking, okay, my race looks like this, or my event looks like this. I'm a mountaineer, so every workout is just going to be carrying a heavy pack uphill. Or I'm an ultra runner, so I just need to run massive miles all the time. And honestly, I think that's a mistake for these, I gave you these extreme examples, but in my experience is, though, if you're deficient in some area in these fundamental qualities, first you identify these fundamental qualities that are important in your sport. And if one of them is deficient, then when you try to train specifically, that deficiency is going to reduce the impact of the specific training. So we need to elevate whatever quality was deficient, so that when you do the specific training, you get the most out of it. So in our case, typically we go through this base phase and then working towards specificity before a major event. And that's rather long-winded and pretty theoretical. I hope that was acceptable to people. They understood what I'm talking about. But so, and the way I keep, to sort of go back to your question, like, how do I keep this fresh? Well, Tom and Ruth, in world-class athletes, it's pretty hard to find the low-hanging fruit with them. And so what they do, a lot of their training is very specific to their event, for sure. And this is, I'm going to try to tie in now the psychological part you brought up, Dirk, with what Rob is saying about how do I keep them engaged and moving forward. So I believe that having them stand on the starting line with confidence that they know they're well prepared that's my job, really. That is the job number one. And the way I get them there is through this progression of, even Tom and Ruth will have a progression of their training that it'll look a little bit less specific in the beginning period of a training block, and becomes more specific as we go. But I believe that what they're going to need, and again, I've seen this with working with my skiers, is if I can show them through during their training that they are getting fitter and fitter, that they're getting faster at the same workout than they were, 2 weeks ago or even a week ago, that's going to have obviously the physical adaptations that are happening. It's going to show them that those are working, which then gives them confidence that I know what I'm doing, because they see, oh, I'm actually faster, or my blood lactates are lower now than they were 2 weeks ago at this same workout. But it also gives them the confidence to know that they're getting fitter and that they're well prepared when they come to the starting line. And so this way we have this sort of double benefit of this type of progression, which is one of the reasons that I have chosen to do a lot of the qualities training sessions with Tom and Ruth on machines, either on a track or on a treadmill, because then we can control the intensity. We can monitor the intensity and the progress using a stopwatch or blood lactates, that sort of thing. And when they can actually see concrete evidence that they're getting fitter through this process, that is an enormous boost, because when Ruth stands on the starting line of UTMB this year, there's going to be a bunch of other women out there that are really fit as well. But if she can go into that race knowing, hey, I can see that I am fitter than I was the year before, as you know, there's a ton of things as happened with Tom at Hardrock. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in these 100-mile races, but we can start them off at the starting line with confidence, both fitness and the psychological confidence that they're well prepared. I think that's the goal. That's the job of the coach.
And you bring up such a good point, Scott, and something I'm super curious about learning from you, and that is, how do you then manage that defeat or like a DNF or in those kinds of things? Because the way I see it, and especially in the mountain ultra trail world, you're only racing a handful of times per year. I come from the track and field background. If you had a bad 800-meter race, you just race again next weekend, and the weekend after that, and the weekend after that, and you can work your way out of it. You can't do that for 100 miles. So how do you manage that where things don't always go as planned?
That problem, let's call it, of not being able to race very often is difficult, because if someone is trying to get into the sport, the way you learn the sport is by doing the sport, and understanding whether it's fueling or pacing or just the psychological stress of being out there, trying to push yourself for 25 hours. That takes experience. And as you said, if you have a bad race in the 800, you go, okay, I took it out 2 seconds fast in the first, whatever. And then the next week you get to try again. Whereas, okay, I took it out too hard in my 100-mile race, and I completely destroyed myself by 80 miles. I had to walk the last 20. Well, you're talking about 3 weeks to recover from that before you can even think about starting to train again. So yeah, it is an issue with this sport. It takes a long time to learn how to do it. What I used to do with my skiers, we'd always have, a wax bench set up out at the stadium of the race. We're out there doing final touch-ups on wax before they get ready to start. And so you're there when they finish. And I've had, skiers come over and just throw their skis down and be really pissed off after their race. And I'd say, okay, go ski for 20 minutes, come back, let's talk when you're, cool down a little bit, because your emotions are high right now. But in that, when it comes time to debrief, sort of the after action report that we need to have with our athletes, then, okay, what went wrong? What went right? What went wrong? I like to take a fairly analytical, separate the emotional component, because there's really not much we can do about the heat of the moment or the emotional part, but analyze, did you go out too hard? Did you pace yourself wrong? Or was it heat? Was it whatever? Was it a training problem? Did we do something wrong in training that's resulted in your not having the kind of race you think you should have? And then it's a sit down and analyze this and then discuss it. I'm lucky in that Tom and Ruth very seldom have bad races. We had a medical problem at Hardrock with Tom, similar with Ruth last year in the Transvolcania race when she got hypothermic. It's kind of rare that they all have a quote unquote bad race. It's, I really can only think of a couple of times. Most of the time people have bad races, it's pacing problems. I haven't heard too many folks talk about this, and it might be helpful for some of the audience, that in a 5K race, if you make a pacing mistake, you are going to know it within seconds. It's like, oh shit, I need to slow down. That took that first half a K or first kilometer. I was too excited, got wrapped up in the, trying to beat these people. And by, I went out too fast, by 15 seconds in the first kilometer. And your body's going to say, you need to slow down or you're going to have to stop.
Or your coach is on the sideline yelling at you too.
Yeah, right. But you'll know right away that you need to slow down. In a 100-mile race or any race that's multiple hours, the intensity is so low compared to what you're maximally capable of that if you can make a similar tiny little pacing error that you won't notice because you're operating down near that first threshold of intensity, which, for any well-trained athlete, it's going to feel pretty darned easy. But if you make that mistake, instead of your body telling you, 5 seconds later, well, you better slow down, it might be 5 or 10 hours later. And by that time, it's too late. Because by that time, you've dug yourself into this massive hole and all of a sudden your legs give out. And so my experience now that I've been working in this ultra running world for as long as I have, which certainly is, fairly short compared to many coaches out there, is that I see most mistakes is that people went out too hard. And they say, well, it felt easy. Yeah, it felt easy because it should feel easy. It just didn't feel easy enough. And then when the wheels come off, 80 miles into the race, there's no way to recoup. Whereas in the 5K, yeah, if you just slow down, a few seconds per kilometer for the next, 5 minutes, you can get it back together in the game. You may not have the best race of your life, but you can recover enough. Whereas it can be kind of catastrophic in these multi-hour things. So I think most people need to understand pacing and be even more conservative. The year that Ruth was second at UTMB, we cautioned her to be extremely careful in the first half of the race because she'd never run that race before. When she got to Courmayeur, which is roughly halfway through the course, she was an hour and 10 minutes behind the winner, Katie Scheid. But she was gaining on Katie so fast toward the end because Ruth still had a lot of legs left to push hard that we did a little extrapolation of the paces that they were running. If that race had been about 5 kilometers longer, Ruth would have won because Katie was fading really fast and Ruth was still coming on. Now, that was probably a mistake in the other direction. We'd told her to be a little too conservative. But anyway, I think this pacing stuff is really the reason that most people struggle with.
Didn't Ruth have the fastest final downhill of even the men?
It was the fourth fastest. She was faster than the winning man in that final 5 kilometer downhill to the finish line at UTMB that year that she was second.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. She was 4 minutes faster than that guy, the guy who won the race. I've forgotten what his name is now. Yeah. So she had a little too much left in the gas tank, unfortunately, in that race. But we lived and learned. And then the next year she came back and last year she had a more aggressive pacing strategy.
So both Rob and I have never done, I don't think you have, never done an ultra. My longest event ever is basically 8 hours. And that's daunting to think about, but that's short compared to these races, UTMB, et cetera. So I almost think that DNFing is inevitable. Is that yes or no? And can it become a positive? Can you turn that DNF into a positive experience?
Yes, I think the answer is, I agree with you. It is almost inevitable that you're going to have, and bad races in these ultras almost always result in a DNF because when things go bad, they go really bad and you're out there for hours and hours. Whereas, again, you can have, like you were just saying, Rob, in the beginning, you can have a crappy 800 and just jump back in the next week. So they're not as catastrophic. So first of all, yes, I agree. They are almost inevitable. You've got to experiment. You've got to try things. In some cases, there's going to be, whether it's health or weather issues, or maybe it's a fueling mistake or whatever. There's some things that are really pretty simple to put your finger on and say, oh, I really screwed this up. But I do think there, like any bad experience in life, there's a lot to be learned from those mistakes. We generally learn more from our mistakes than our successes. So being open to, a real honest critique after a bad race, I think is very important. What went right, what went wrong. And I do think you can learn it took Tom 4 attempts to win UTMB. The first year that I was working with him, that he went there, he was 3rd place. And that was the first time he'd raced that race. He was being like Ruth the first time, very conservative. The next 2 years were DNFs for Tom. Fairly early on, they were DNFs, but they were massive learning experiences of, controlling the ego. Do you need to be in the top 10, by the time you get to Courmayeur? I mean, that the second year that Tom DNF'd, none of the first 10 guys into Courmayeur even finished that race. And it was, so you can imagine that was a bunch of dudes, egos out there, like, look at me, look how strong I am, and pushing and pushing and pushing. And then poof, for every single one of those top 10, the wheels came off, and none of them and these were all the contenders that everybody was expecting to be on the podium. So, that I think is learning to control your ego, and especially in these ultra long races where the intensity is low enough that you can actually formulate think thoughts. You can actually have real thoughts in your head. It's not like, an 800 where, it's like you're chasing the rabbit and that's just, that's all there is really. There's very, obviously there's some pacing, but you're only out there for less than 2 minutes. You don't have a lot of time to cogitate on things. Whereas you're out there for 20 hours, many, many thoughts are going to go through your mind. So yeah, I think that the self-control that's needed, and the kind of the check on the ego is very important. That's, again, one of the pacing problems. I know that, Dirk, you and I think have talked a little bit about this in some of those longer schemo races you've done. I mean, everybody is going to feel good when the gun goes off. And, it's so easy then to get into this, like testing yourself against your competitors really early in the race. And you both have enough racing experience I think you could concur with this, that it is so rare that someone wins a major endurance event from the gun. It happens, obviously. Like, I used to love to watch David Rudisha race the 800. There's a guy who, he's going to win these races from the start. But it's rare enough that we always think of it as a pretty special thing when the person goes off from the gun and they're still winning at, whatever hours later. So, conserving, being careful, again, going back to that pacing idea, and just not getting wrapped up in trying to show off is a silly word, but it's a silly term, but it's kind of what I mean. It's like, if you want to show off in the last few kilometers, not in the first few.
Yeah, it's funny because the older you get, the better you understand it, because when you're young, you can absorb more of the mistakes. You can go out too fast, realize it, and kind of back off, if you will. But being older, if I go out it's just like game over, and I think within my own long distance, 6 to 8 hour type events, I've learned the governors to put in place. Can you speak of any of that? Like, the ego takes over, and therefore you hit a checkpoint too fast. Like, are you putting in any kind of governors on the athlete of like, don't get here before this time, don't go over this pace, heart rate, whatever it might be?
Yeah, that is, well, yes, I think it's important to have those. We've tried a number of different things. I think it's very difficult in these mountain races to try to set a pace strategy. I'd like to have a pacing strategy, and I think it can be helpful in the very early stages of the race, especially if it's going to be to constrain the output of the athlete. But at some point in the race, that the pacing strategy is going to go out the window due to, whether it's conditions or your competitors. Like trying to get the message across to the athletes that you're not going to win this race in the first 5 hours. You're going to win it in the last 5 hours of the race. And what I've sort of settled on, or what I believe works best, we don't have a great way of measuring power. We don't have a great way of measuring pace, because it's changing, constantly on the terrain, whether it's the terrain or the roughness of the trail. So pacing is very difficult. Yes, you could say, okay, I don't want you to get to the first checkpoint before this amount of time, but that's kind of hard for the athlete to control during the race, because how would they be controlling that? They have to be able to think ahead, unless they've run that course many times and they have intermediate checkpoints and they could know, oh, I'm a little too fast to such and such place. And so unfortunately, it kind of comes back to heart rate, which, is a rather, it's a crude proxy for intensity and speed. But unfortunately, it's really about the best we've got. We don't have anything in these kinds of sports. I don't think we have anything yet that's any better. So what I try to do with athletes I work with is one of the reasons we train a lot using blood lactate. I want them to, their race intensity is going to be at around 2.5 millimoles per liter of blood lactate. That's really the kind of intensity that they can potentially sustain for hours. It may go a little bit above 3 on some of the climbs, but if it gets up higher than that, we've got a problem. And so I want them to know what that feels like on different types of terrain, different gradients, different the roughness of the trail, so that in the race, it kind of goes. They're going to be able to use the heart rate and the RPE to put the package together of going, okay, that this pace is a little too hot right now. I need to back off slightly, so that they don't end up, several hours later going, oh, damn it, I was just I pushed those uphills a little too hard. So we try to, and especially for an elite athlete, I think RPE can be a really valuable tool, because they've done enough training, and especially if they've done it in controlled environment, where they're using heart rate and lactates to get a feel for, how RPE correlates to those actual physiological symptoms or signs. Whereas what I have found with a lot of folks who are just beginning training, who have never, especially those that we talked about earlier, that are aerobically deficient, is they don't even know what easy feels like. They've never, there's this, no pain, no gain type of mentality in endurance training that has, I've spent much of my career trying to thwart that sort of thinking. But so you can't let them, they can't go on RPE. That's why you have to use heart rate, especially with people that are just starting out, and say, okay, here's the red line. I do not want you going over this heart rate. And that can be very difficult for those people that are, have come from that no pain, no gain school of training. They go, well, this is too easy. How can this possibly be doing anything? It doesn't feel hard to me.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier in terms of specificity of training, because you got me thinking about this when talking about going uphill and heart rate being the determining factor in some ways, about effort and all these kinds of things. But when you look at all the different types of 100-mile races out there, Western States is not Hardrock, is not UTMB. They're wildly different races, wildly different verticals, wildly different, terrain, all these kinds of things. So how do you then take an athlete through a season, and do you have to train with some level of specificity to those different types of terrains and types of races?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell a little bit of a lesson on a mistake here. So going into the year that Tom won Western States, we really focused a lot on faster running. There's a fair bit of climbing at Western States, but then there's a lot of long, gradual, flat and downhill running there. And so we knew that his running economy at around 4 and 5 minute kilometer pace was going to be very important. So we spent a lot more time on the track that year, and it paid off. He had a great race there. Then the mistake that was made was that he decided immediately after winning Western States, I want to go race UTMB, which is an entirely different kind of race. You know, a race where speed plays a much, much smaller role, and, you know, climbing ability and the use of poles. You know, poles aren't even allowed at Western states, or I don't think they're allowed. No one uses them. And so we had to do, you know, a 180-degree shift in the training. And we really didn't have enough time to make that switch. And so that was the first year that he did a DNF at UTMB. And I think it was partly due to the fact that, you know, we just did not have enough time to prepare him well for that race. So absolutely, you have to look at, I mean, I like to use this term, like, as I was talking about identifying the fundamental qualities that need to be enhanced to perform well in a particular type of event, you need to train for the demands of the event. I mean, if the event has, you know, like the UTMB with, you know, over 30,000 vertical feet, 10,000 meters of elevation gain and loss, then you better be prepared for that demand, because that's probably one of the most significant determining factors in performance. So the training will be considerably different than, let's say, Leadville, which, even though it's at high altitude, is a fair, from the standpoint of these mountain running races, it's a fairly mellow course in terms of the amount of elevation gain and loss. So, yeah, specificity plays a big role, and that's why, you know, going back to my comments about these fundamental qualities, you need to have enough time to enhance those fundamental qualities. So, you know, shifting gears from a race like Western States, it would have been ideal if we'd had, you know, 5 or 6 months of just base building in these more fundamental things like strength and muscular endurance and, you know, a climbing ability and all of that. We just didn't have it. And so he went into that race in a kind of compromised state. So yeah, you're absolutely right to point that out.
So does that kind of mean that gone are the days of people being able to go run a sky race and then go do Western States and then perhaps, well, a Hardrock double would be a little crazy. A few have done it, but then, you know, going on to doing all these different types of ultras. Does that mean that the state of the industry, the state of the sport sort of precipitates the need to be super specific about the type of race you're training for?
In my opinion, yes. I mean, obviously there's going to be outliers. There's going to be people who can do it all. I mean, you know, Courtney Dauwalter is a perfect example of somebody who seems to be indestructible, able to, you know, jump off out of one race and a few weeks later jump into another race and perform extremely well. But I'm not sure we can use outliers ever in a sport to say what the general trend is. But I think that what's happening in the sport of ultra running is more specificity, more specialization is what I meant to say. So when I was coaching, you know, think about your years as an 800-meter runner. I mean, did you ever contemplate doing a marathon during that time? Probably not. You know, people would have said to you that's insane. Or when I was coaching skiers, like, you know, in the discipline or in the sport of cross country skiing, you have everything from as short as a 3.5-minute sprint event that they call, and up to a 2+ hour 50-kilometer race. And now we have an outlier in Johannes Klebo, who dominates across this full spectrum. But most people don't have that gift. And when I first started coaching at the World Cup level, I was coaching a couple of guys who were really good sprinters. But yet the tradition in cross-country skiing has been, well, you show up at a series, like a race, and there'll be the sprint is one day, and the next day is going to be a 30K, and then a day later a 15K or whatever. And everybody thought they had to do every event. And I began to notice that especially some of the top Norwegians, they specialized. You know, well, there was guys who were really good at 50K, and there was guys who were good at sprinting. And I told my guys, hey, you know, you're a sprinter, you're a fast twitch athlete, you know, you're not going to be competitive at the World Cup level in a 50K. So let's just focus on what you're good at. I mean, look at the sport of swimming. Yes, you have a Michael Phelps who can do everything, but most people say, no, I am really good at the 200 butterfly or whatever it is. And like, that's their event. And, most of us are dealing with somewhat limited genetics. Let's say we're not a Klebo, we're not a Michael Phelps, and we're not a Courtney Dauwalter. And so I think that what we're seeing as the sport matures, we may see more specialization. And again, trying to putting aside the remarkable outliers that are out there in sports. But most of us would just be happy to have to win one race. We don't have to dominate the entire world in every single event. Like Klebo, did he win? He didn't lose anything at the Olympics. I mean, but so, and same with Phelps. He didn't lose a darn race. So most of us just don't have that gift. So I took my guys and said, we're just going to make you the best possible sprinters that we can, and it worked. It worked really well for them. And just like play your strong hand, you can, if you want to enter a 30K, great, go do it. But, really your race is here. I don't want you doing a 50K and then the next day think you're going to have the best sprint of your life. It's not going to happen. I don't care. You're just not that gifted. So I think we are seeing the evolution of our sport looking a little more like more traditional sports. Like when you would show up to a track meet, you didn't think, okay, I'm going to race this day, I'm going to race the 400, then the next day I'm going to race the 800, and the next day I'm going to race the 5,000. The next, that just doesn't happen in a mature sport. And I think we're seeing more of a mature sport develop.
Yeah, the other word I think about, and we talk about, is sort of just the professionalization of trail running.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing more dollars being poured in, so therefore more athletes who maybe weren't as interested in trail, maybe they were trying to be marathoners or whatever that was, coming over to the sport, which has also led to a lot of really fast times. So we're seeing, especially on the women's side, across the board, new records are getting set year in and year out. How does it affect your athletes? How do they respond to that? And how do you think about the evolution of the sport? Because it's happening right in front of our eyes.
I don't have any control over the evolution of the sport. I'm along for the ride, honestly. I mean, I take the athletes I work with it doesn't matter to me. Like, I try to have a bit of input as to where I think they should be putting their energy and time. But, if, one of them says, I want to go do such and such, and I think it's kind of a silly idea, I say, okay, I'll support you the best I can. That's not my job. Maybe they probably have obligations I'm not even aware of with sponsors and that sort of thing. Plus they have their own dreams and desires and it's not my job to, I can counsel them a little bit, but I'm not their manager. I'm just the coach. I'm presented with, okay, here's the event we were training for. Do the best job you can getting them ready for that. And I kind of limit myself, try to stay in that lane pretty much. But I hear what you're saying, and I completely agree that we are in the midst of a kind of a revolution in the sport of ultra running.
Yeah, I guess in part, the way I think about it too, and I'm curious how you or your athletes kind of manage this internally, is like, all of a sudden they are seeing wild performances. Maybe not even the races that they're intending to do, but they can see how the field, like the top 5 women at Black Canyon or whatever it might have been, are just running lights out. How does that affect then their mentality in thinking about, are they doing enough? Are they comparing themselves to others? And how do you manage that anxiety or lack thereof, I guess, maybe in your athletes?
It comes back to what I can do is give them training and a progression of training that moves them ahead, both mentally and physically, so they're prepared. There's always the risk that somebody's going to beat them. And we can't, I don't know, you can't really control that. I tell the athletes, I've always done this with, like, you're out there to do the best you can do on that day. And I think you guys have even talked to Tom about this, and I've heard him say it publicly a number of times. Like after Hardrock, he said, I couldn't have won that race on a good day with Ludo out there. I mean, Ludo Ludo was going to be unbeatable in that race. And Tom was willing to accept that. Obviously he had the medical problem, so didn't get a chance. But had Tom finished and Ludo had beaten him, which I think I agreed, Ludo probably would have won that race. Tom was willing to accept that and say, yeah, you were the better man on this day. That's the way it is. You were better than I am. So I try to encourage that sort of attitude is, we want to do the best job we possibly can in preparing the athlete for this race, but that does not guarantee that they're going to win. It does not guarantee that, that they're going to, if we do a good job and that we feel confident, we can put them on the starting line with the confidence that they know they're going to be competitive, but it can't protect them psychologically from the fact that, somebody else could be having the race of their life on that same day. And you can't do anything about that. You can only control what you can control. And I've always used this, especially when I was coaching young skiers, was we don't focus on outcome goals. We focus on process goals. And if we take these little baby steps and we meet these process goals, then you're much more likely to have a positive outcome. But if you just go right to the outcome goal, I'm going to win this race, well, that's at that point, it's no longer a goal. It's a dream. It's a hope. And I don't really like to rely on that. So even with Tom and Ruth, I've had some people say, "Oh, Ruth, you should go for the course record on UTMB this year." And I said, "That's silly. It's so many things could happen. Like, no, let's just concentrate on having you be in the best possible version of Ruth on that day." And first we have, this is something I told Tom last year before UTMB, because he'd had these two very disappointing DNFs. I said, if you want to finish first you have to finish. And that was the attitude he had to take into that race. So if Ruth wants to break the course record, well, then the first thing she has to do is be the best version of herself. If she is, then maybe she can win. And if she wins, maybe she can break the course record. But course record is not the goal. It's like, show up on the starting line the best version of yourself. And then everything else that comes out of it, we have a better chance of having those positive outcomes at that point.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, Tom definitely said that going into Hardrock. If you think about the journey is the 99.9% of the experience, then enjoy that, control what you can there, and then learn from the experience.
Well, and I think that's the message for there's people that like endurance sports, and there's people that that don't like endurance sports. And the people that like and thrive in endurance sports, they better embrace that journey. And they better embrace those meeting those process goals, because that's the bulk of their time is spent on those things. And if you don't enjoy that, if that's not really the pleasure you get from the activity, it's very unlikely you're going to have good results in the long run, even if you're a gifted athlete. You better love training. You better love being out there by yourself for hours and hours at a time, and you better not need a lot of external motivation. You better be really good at internally motivating yourself. And so it's almost like a personality type, I think. It's more of a type A type of a person, I think, that really thrives on, first of all, you thrive on discomfort, and you thrive on this delayed gratification, because it's going to be, especially in this ultra running world where it might be months between races, and all the rest of that time is spent, in a rather boring pursuit. So you better enjoy it.
Just recently, I think in the running world, we were at least peripherally aware of Josh Kerr of Great Britain breaking the world record in the mile. And one of the more fantastic pieces of content that I consumed in his interviews was him talking about he didn't do any special workouts in preparation for this. What he articulated was a decades long consistency of doing all the little things correctly and consistently. And then that meant then the world record in the mile became attainable 10 years later. And so I think that plays in directly with what you're saying here.
Consistency is absolutely the most important quality. No single workout or even type of workout is going to be what, produces these fantastic results. Whether it's your own personal journey or it's a world record, it's the consistency. It's getting out there. It's the volume of training. The biggest stimulus to improve endurance is volume of training. Yes, and there are variations, but it's just doing it, day after day after day, year after year that produces those results. As you just pointed out, people want to know, okay, what was the secret? What was it? What was that workout that did it, that pushed you over the edge? And luckily, it sounds like he responded, well, there wasn't any secret. It's just me, hitting the track every day for years. One of the first times this became apparent to me, I'm a fan of the history of track and running, and one of my early heroes was Sebastian Coe. Many people in the audience may even remember Coe. He's a double gold medalist in the 800 and 1500 meters. He was coached by his father, who wasn't a runner at all, but an engineer who designed some really cool training progressions for him. And at one point, I think it was in around 1980, he went on a world record-breaking spree. You probably could correct me on this, Rob. I may get some of the details wrong, but as I remember, over the course of 2 months, he broke every world record from the 800 to the 3,000 meters, somewhere like something like that, right? Okay, and his father had a particular workout that they would do from time to time, and it was 45 200s. And they were, of course, very carefully controlled in the pace and all that. And in the last one he did before he went on this world record-breaking spree was 45 200s working from 27 seconds down to 23 seconds. And with like a, 30-second, 1-minute jog in between these 200s. And people immediately went, well, that was the secret. That's what did it. But Peter Coe, the father, said, no, all this did was show us that he was ready to go break those world records. This was not the secret workout. It was just like, now you have demonstrated you have the work capacity to do this much hard work in this very short period of time at this very high speed, that we're confident that you can now go break these records. And I think this is a mistake that we see in the popular press often after someone has a remarkable performance. This is really common in things like Runner's World magazine and others. Is like, they run your best, here's the three workouts that so-and-so did before they won the Chicago Marathon. It's like, no, that's not what made them win the Chicago Marathon. It's the fact that, they have just spent the last 15 years getting ready to do those 3 workouts and progressing, and they can handle that work. So it's a little bit like, it's the process that, Josh Kerr or Sebastian Coe, it doesn't matter who you are. It's that process that gets you there. There's no secrets to this sport, really.
I know personal success, personal achievement is so boring. And with that high or not.
Yeah. I think this has been so wonderful. I mean, we could talk about running for ages, Scott, and I know that we've had that offline a time or two, but this is just so incredible to have these conversations with you and learn more about sort of the ultra running community and just your perspective on how to get to that finish line for all types of.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've enjoyed about my exposure to this sport is the democratization of it. Having spent years and years on the World Cup in cross-country skiing, where there's a chain link fence between the athletes and the audience and the spectators. And I'm sure, you go to a Diamond League track meet. You don't get to go out there and rub shoulders with those athletes. You're up in the stadium and they're down there. Whereas in this sport, like everybody, not everybody, but it's open to everyone. Like, when I've gone to world championships in cross country skiing, if you don't have a certain pass, you can't get into the stadium, you can't do these things. Whereas, you go to you go to Chamonix at UTMB, and you're just out there, walking down the streets with some of the best people in the world in these sports. And I've really enjoyed that. I think that's a really nice, healthy attitude. We don't, yes, they're still elite athletes, but they're not like physically, there's not a wall between, whether you're a spectator or a fellow competitor. There's not a barrier to you to interact with them, and my experience has been, in general, the athletes in the sports are they embrace that sort of that aspect, that democratization, that, hey, we're all in this together. We're all, having these same experiences out there. And I think anybody who has listened to, Tom and Ruth speak about their races and whatnot can see that, they're not putting themselves on a pedestal above other people. When the year that Tom won Western States, I was so tired at the end of that. When he finally got to the finish line, I just wanted to go lie down. He stayed out there for hours, welcoming people coming across the finish line, getting pictures taken with families and babies and, all of that kind of stuff. And that was so refreshing for me to see. I just thought that was a wonderful aspect of this sport. I really like it.
Yeah, you can do, the Tour de France just wrapped up, and not everybody can just go hop in the Tour de France, but you can hop in some of these races or qualify for them or go enjoy them, be on the same start line. So that's definitely refreshing and so great to see. And transparency is awesome. We're sharing, knowledge here, and the experiences. We all have the same mental questions on the start line as the pros, and how to overcome that and achieve great things in your own personal way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on, guys. It's great chatting. It's good seeing you both.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Awesome. Super. We'll see you on the start line somewhere.
All righty. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Endurance Unlimited. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on your platform of choice to never miss new episodes. Also, be sure to leave a 5-star rating to let your coach and the algorithm know you're ready to dial in your training. Find more resources to help you take on your next challenge at TrainingPeaks.com, or find us on social media at TrainingPeaks. Got questions? Leave a comment or send an email to podcast@trainingpeaks.com. Good luck in whatever you're training for, and trust the process to reach your potential.